Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Learners Republic Policy Fellowship 2022. This year we are hosting 50 fellows from 18 cities of Pakistan. We have a strong, diverse cohort. They are emerging learners and wanted to explore themselves in the world of policy. We have fellows from different educational backgrounds, cultures, and religion. Some of them are from undergrad, some are in their graduation program or in PhDs. They are a cohort that wanted to welcome the policy fellowship to another level. Last year we also host the cohort. This year we have another energetic cohort. If you like the fellows wanted to introduce themselves, that we can do that, and then we'll move to the formal introduction about Miss Maha Kamal. Or
So Assalamu alaikum. Welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to meet all of you. I have had very good experiences with the last cohorts of Learners Republic, so it's a pleasure to meet all of you. And of course, I am delighted that the Learners Republic is always such a diverse group in terms of the fellowship. A bit about myself: I am an international climate policy expert, and my own work focuses on energy and climate policy. So I have co-founded this organization called Women in Energy Pakistan, and I was formerly teaching at the Information Technology University, where I was teaching the Masters in Development Studies cohort and supervising master's thesis related to energy and climate related areas. So climate itself is a topic that's not just academic for me. It's something that's very close to my heart. As you all might also be aware, as Learners Republic Fellows, that climate is an issue that pervades all of the issues, right? It's one of those umbrella topics that is going to affect our lives, our livelihoods, and the economy as we know it as well. And so because of that, my own research is focused on the Paris Agreement. We're going to talk a bit more about the Paris Agreement, what that is as well. So a bit show of hands, who here knows a bit about climate change or is interested in this topic? If you can raise your hand.
Just to add on, I thought I'll give you the formal introduction when you start the topic, but just to tell you all fellows that there's no one better who can explain you about international climate policy than Miss Maha Kamal. She's not just a graduate of international public policy from Queen Mary University of London as a Fulbright scholar, but also holds 2 undergrad degrees from Boston University, one in international relations and other in journalism. And she's just incredible. कुछ लोग होते हैं जिनकी तारीफ में आप लफ्ज छोटे पड़ जाते हैं. So her introduction just need like whole 15 minutes to tell you guys, but you will be learning a lot from her today. So you're blessed to have her today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hira, for the kind introduction. As you're far too kind in your words. Of course, as Learners Republic, I am one of your fellow learners. I would consider myself to be that because, of course, learning itself is a lifelong journey, right? And especially with a topic like climate policy, you can never learn enough, right? And so we're all part of the same journey. I might be a bit ahead of you in terms of climate policy, but there are other areas itself that I hope to learn from you today as well. And so I would like to keep it interactive once I'm done with the holistic overview of what international climate policy is and basically set the context. But I would encourage you all, once I'm done with the formal part of the presentation today, to speak up, to raise concerns, and to actually learn from each other today as well. So thank you, Hira, for that start as well. So I think I'll just share my screen and then we can formally begin. All right, so if somebody can confirm if they can see the screen and then we can start.
Yes, it's all good.
Okay, great. All right, so we're going to be talking about international climate policy today. And so we are going to be learning about the global scenario of international climate and international politics as well. Essentially, what climate change is, why it's an important issue. And then once we're done with the substantive part and explore the governance related issues of it, then I'm going to open the floor and make it more contextual to Pakistan. That's going to be more of a conversation with all of you. So with that, today's agenda is essentially, we're going to be learning about climate reality. So I am also a climate reality leader. So I'm going to share a bit about what climate reality is, and what that means is basically what is climate change and why is it important and why do we talk about it, right? So we're going to set the stage there. And then we're going to open the floor and explore the governance setup. What essentially is international climate governance? Basically, इसमें हम ये देखते हैं कि कौन से actors हैं who are responsible for the policy decisions, who are the main bodies who are responsible to essentially look at climate, but also regulate climate. Essentially, दो चीजों की हम बात करते हैं when we think about climate governance. The essential goal is adaptation and mitigation, right? And so there are bodies responsible for this, and we're going to delve deeper into who those are, who those actors are, what those bodies are. Then we're going to circle back to how this is related to public policy. Why is climate change a policy issue? Since this is largely a policy fellowship, I thought that would be interesting to bring in those aspects as well. And then we're going to talk about a bit about international climate negotiation. Why is it important? How is it done? Who are the main negotiating blocks when it comes to climate? Unki kya different positions hain? What are the issues that they agree on? Where do they disagree? So with that, this is our planet Earth. And as we know, essentially, when we think about climate, you have to focus on the fact that we only have one Earth, right? And with rising global emissions, that Earth as we know it is changing. And so that's why this issue is of the utmost importance as well, right? So when you think about this as an issue, what's important is that essentially to get a sense of the scale of this issue, when it comes to man-made pollution, we are spewing 152 million tons of man-made global warming pollution into the thin shell of our atmosphere. And you saw that thin shell right over here. So this is what we know as the atmosphere, right? That thin shell of our atmosphere. And every 24 hours, we, humankind, as we know it, are treating it as if it were an open sewer, right? And what's really, really important is that previously climate change was understood to be a natural phenomenon, right? People thought that okay, it's just part of how the earth is changing very naturally. But 1970s onward, we see this extreme spike in the rise in global emissions, and that has definitely impacted rise in global temperatures. And then scientifically it was established that there is a human link to climate change, right? What we call यहाँ पर जो word इस्तेमाल हुआ है man-made global warming का word इस्तेमाल हुआ है, but the Inter-Panel Governmental Authority on Climate Change, basically the IPCC, which is the scientific body responsible to basically collect all the scientific evidence on climate change. What they have said is that this is anthropogenic. And what they mean by anthropogenic is essentially this, that climate change is man-made, that there's a human link to climate change. And because there's a human link to climate change, that means we as humans have the capacity to control our global carbon emissions as well. And so just a bit about the science of it. So you see it basically here. So solar radiation in the form of light waves passes through the atmosphere, and then this radiation is absorbed by the Earth, and then some energy is radiated back into space in the form of infrared waves, right? And some of this outgoing infrared radiation is then trapped by the Earth's atmosphere, and this trapping is essentially what warms it. And so as the carbon dioxide concentration really increases, more of this outgoing infrared radiation is really trapped. And that's essentially what we see in this rise in global temperatures, not just in the surface level temperatures, but also in terms of the oceans as well. And so what are the different forms of greenhouse gases? When we think about climate change, what are the different forms of it, right? And so this picture gives you this overview of what are the different forms of greenhouse gases that we can essentially see. And so we see that these are some of the different forms when we think about it, right? We have thawing permafrost, we have coal power plants, we have oil production, fertilization, forest burning, land transport, landfills, industrial agriculture, so on and so forth. So these are some of the forms in which overall we are seeing this rise in greenhouse gases. And you must have heard of this as well, that when we think about thermal energy, which is essentially considered to be oil, gas, or coal, these are some of the biggest emitters when it comes to greenhouse gases. And so are the way we consume energy, the way we use our transport, forms of how we indulge in agricultural practices, all of this has an impact on global climate change. And so when you think about the largest sources of global warming, pollution is the burning of fossil fuels, right? What I've recently summarized for you as well, what we call these thermal sources of energy, oil, gas, and coal primarily. So these are fossil fuels. And what I was telling you earlier here as well, that 1970s onward, you see this extreme spike when it comes to global warming and pollution. And so this burning of fossil fuels is essentially responsible for creating this trapping this these carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere as well. And so you can basically see it measured in terms of billion metric tons of carbon, and all of this collectively are the sources of global warming. And so when you try to correlate that with the rise in global surface temperatures, we see this departure from the average, right? We're seeing here that essentially you see this rise in terms of the global surface temperature all the way up to, and it keeps going upwards as well. And we see that happening recently as well. And some of the hottest years on record have actually occurred since the year 2001 as well, right? And really, some of the hottest have really been in the last 5 or 6 years. So this is a bit old as well. So we can say last 7 years as well, with the recently with COVID a bit halted in 2020, but we still did not see a stopping in extreme weather events, even during COVID as well, despite the fact that the world economy slowed down. So that's something that is really alarming as a global community.
Michael, I know we are all aware of the current market situation, and I want to assure you.
So when we think about the economy, this is really what we think about as the cost of carbon, right? And so really, when we think about carbon dioxide, it's labeled as #1 threat to the global economy, because we're seeing this global instability is linked to the cost of carbon. Basically, every single carbon dioxide in terms of tons that we're emitting into the planet is linked to all of these different consequences, right? And so we see this cost of carbon as not just an environmental cost, but an economic cost, but also a human cost, right? Because we're seeing political instability, we're seeing the rise in climate refugees, people who have had to change their homes, change their modes of operation, their livelihoods. We've seen ecosystem loss, we've seen extreme weather events, right? When it comes to Pakistan, for example, we've seen heat waves emerge, we've seen floods, we've seen droughts, and all of this is part of the fact that when it comes to a climate risk, Pakistan is unfortunately, when it comes to countries who are the most vulnerable to climate change, Pakistan consistently ranks amongst the top 10 most vulnerable to climate change, right? And in fact, right now, German Watch has labeled it as #8 when it comes to the climate risk index, but Pakistan has consistently been in the top 10 as the most vulnerable to climate change. So we have all experienced the cost of carbon, and we're going to continue to experience it. And that is going to affect not just our economy as we know it, but also political stability. It's linked to the overall governance challenge. And so we need these strengthening institutions in order to understand the cost of carbon as Pakistanis as well. So the question is, can we change, right? So we understand the gravity and the fact that this is such an important and such a contentious issue. But the question is, do we as humans and we as a global society, do we have the capacity to change, and can we change, right? So that's a question we must ask ourselves. And we do have the solutions at hand as well. But the question is, will we change? So yeah, we have the solutions, but do we have the political will? And this is when we come to the Paris Agreement that I mentioned earlier to you as well. So in 2015, every nation in the world agreed that they were going to work together to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by mid-century. What we mean by net zero is that the carbon emissions that are basically overall produced on the planet must equal the sources of removal of carbon as well. So overall, your carbon emissions become net zero, right? And so that's the goal. You must have heard of the phrase net zero by 2050, which is proclaimed as a goal that the global community must head towards, for example, by the World Economic Forum. But it's contentious, right? The fact that is 2050 too far off now? And the fact that the current challenges that we're facing, for example, the UN Secretary General has said that this is basically it's a now or never situation now, right? When it comes to climate change. And that is why you must have heard, if you were following COP26, the conference that happened in Glasgow on climate change earlier at the end of last year, you must have heard that people were saying that that was now or never, right? The decisions that they were going to make when it comes to climate change, how are they going to affect it, right? What is interesting is that when it comes to the climate crisis, we've seen a lot of activism as well, right? We've seen that overall, the fact that there is this commitment towards fighting climate change, which we saw in the 2015 Paris Agreement, where the world agreed that they were going to work together to it. But they do it in the form of what we call these nationally determined contributions, right? So every country comes up with their own list of goals. And so we have this process, which is bottom up. What we mean by that is that individually countries decide that what are the goals that they're going to be able to achieve in order to combat climate change. And so they come up with that in the form of a nationally determined contribution. And all of the different individual nationally determined contributions have to equal towards that net zero goal as a global community, right? What happened after Paris was that countries' individual NDCs were misaligned with the overall goal that countries were going to limit the global rise in temperature to 2 degrees or best by 1.5 degrees, right? That individual contributions were not equaling that. And that's where the challenge really lies, right? And that was a challenge for COP26 as well, is that how do we mobilize countries and get them to work together to a goal that really meets our global goals as well? So what was the agenda? The agenda was that they really had to secure global net zero by mid-century, and they had to keep 1.5 degrees within reach. In fact, you must have noted that there's a lot of debate when it comes to what is the acceptable temperature limit, right? Paris said 2 degrees and best 1.5 degrees, but that changed in COP26, where they said that keeping it in 1.5 degrees was essential. Then the idea was that they really had to adapt to protect communities and natural habitats. And then how do we make this happen, right? So you have all of these goals, but unless you have the funding to back it up, that's where climate finance comes into question as well. And in fact, Copenhagen May, you must have heard, came 2009. Countries agreed that they were going to commit $100 billion every year towards the goal of climate change starting in 2020. But overall, what countries actually ended up doing was that they were hardly able to meet $80 billion, right? So what they'd committed to, the promises that they had made, fell short of what really needs to happen in order to realize the goals of climate change. And so we're going to talk a bit about that as well. How do we mobilize funding? What are the different sources? And for all of that to actually happen, they really must work together to deliver. And so coming to international climate governance, you have to think about this in the in a very structured manner. So we have the UN framework on the Convention of Climate Change, which is the UNFCCC, or you can say UNFCCC. And how it actually functions is that every year it has the Conference of Parties, which is the COPs that you must have heard of, such as COP26 in Glasgow very recently. Then we have the meeting of parties to Kyoto Protocol. So you must recall that in 95, they had this agreement called Kyoto Protocol, which was less legally binding than the Paris Agreement. And then we have the CMA, which is the meeting of parties to the Paris Agreement. So this is essentially the UN structure when it comes to climate governance, and essentially the bodies responsible to govern climate change. Other related bodies, which are part of this cooperation with UN bodies and intergovernmental organizations, are the IPCC, which I mentioned at the very start when I was talking about the scientific evidence. And so we see this Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We have the Green Climate Fund, which is essentially, as I was telling you, climate finance is really crucial to achieving all of these goals. So we have the Green Climate Fund, we have the Global Environment Facility, we have the Special Climate Change Fund, and we have the Lead Fund. And so all of these must mobilize and work together, cooperating in order to ensure that they meet the climate goals. And so when it comes to the zones at COP, you must have heard about the inner blue zone. This is where the basically the negotiations were happening. And then we had these different pavilions that were set up, which were basically either in the outer green zone or beyond the green zone, which meant all of the different actors who were responsible in COP, how they were actually working. So this is just to get a sense of what the COPs actually look like on the ground. Now we come to climate change negotiations, and this is where it gets really, really interesting because, of course, climate, while being an issue that is affecting all of our lives, it is what we call a wicked problem when it comes to public policy. And what we mean by a wicked problem is that there are aspects and facets to the climate problem that are basically fraught with complexity and make it a difficult problem, right? The fact is, we have issues such as climate justice that come to mind. For example, countries like Pakistan, for example, emit less than 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions, right? And similarly, there are other developing countries whose emissions aren't really substantial enough. So these countries sometimes argue that because they're not responsible for global climate change, they shouldn't be forced to commit to these different goals, right? Or comply to these different policies. And so you have this cartoon here, which essentially tries to capture climate change negotiations and the different blocks or the different negotiating ideas. We have this small state delegation. We have this big state delegation that are talking about migration, adaptation, compliance. And then we have this happening here that they're saying some states are more equal than others. What that means is that essentially, when it comes to creating this sense of climate justice, some countries have contributed more towards climate emissions, but aren't they necessarily going to solve the problem? Or are they going to force other countries to solve it without necessarily playing the role of a leader themselves, right? For example, when it comes to the biggest global carbon or greenhouse gas emissions, we know that the US and China both are responsible. China, when it comes to the overall total greenhouse gas emissions, but if you do it in per capita terms, then the US, right? So both of these are really, really responsible for climate change. And so who tries to solve the problem? That's where this comes in. And so this is just a sense of the negotiation process. We have the UNFCCC Secretariat, we have the different participants, and then we have the different parties. And so on the ground, this is how the negotiation actually happens. But even less formally, we have all of this negotiation happening throughout the year as well, with different countries asserting their different rights all throughout the year as well. For example, when it comes to the developing countries, we know that the world really has to talk about meeting the goal of 1.5 degrees as a global goal. And so when it comes to the negotiating bloc, we have the G77, which were led by China. We have the least developed countries. We have the like-minded developing countries. We have the small island developing states, the Africa group, Arab group, European Union. We have the Independent Alliance of Latin America. We have the BASIC group, which is Brazil, South Africa, China, and India, which is a really important negotiating bloc when it comes to climate justice as well. Then we have the Caribbean Community, the Coalition for Rainforest Nations, the Umbrella Group, which is largely the developed countries. And then we have OPEC, which is again the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, who are huge of course, they're beneficiaries of the fossil fuel regime as well, but they're impacted by climate change regulation as well. So they're one of the negotiating blocks in COPs. So just to get a sense of the history of the different COPs, we had the Rio Earth Summit. We then had the UNFCCC signatories. And then in 97, we really had Kyoto, which is the first legally binding climate treaty, right? And then we saw that there was this breakthrough in Bonn, but that was without the US, right? And so that's really what makes it crucial to understand as well, is that the actors who are largely responsible for climate change, primarily US and China, if either one of these two parties are absent, then it really makes the global agreement really difficult to understand. And so we saw that the Kyoto Protocol took effect, but at this point, again, climate change wasn't as big a priority in terms of the global community. And we saw that in terms of the efficacy, that was really at hand then. Then we saw that negotiations began for Kyoto 2.0 in 2007. And so we had this UN climate change conference. Then finally, the US joined these bold statements of the UN in 2009. We say Derai Durusta, right? But then we had this in Copenhagen. This is where really there were a lot of hopes vested in Copenhagen that there was going to be a breakthrough that was going to happen. But then there was disappointment and at the very end as well. In fact, our special assistant to the Prime Minister on climate change, Malik Amin Aslam, has actually called this a decade of disappointment when it comes to climate change as well, right? Because all of these things were happening, these developments were happening, but then in terms of climate action, there was a lot that could have been done, but wasn't. And so there was a lot of hope vested in Glasgow last year that were global communities, were different countries actually going to take climate action more seriously. Glasgow itself is contentious as well. We can talk about more about that in the Q&A and once we become more interactive as well. Then we had Doha. We had no deal in Doha. Then there was a walkout in Warsaw. But in 2015, we had the landmark Paris Agreement reached, right? And so basically the idea was that in 2018, the rules were decided, basically what I was telling you earlier, that how is it actually going to be solved? Then we had the UN chief plans the climate action summit, but then again, we have more disappointment when it comes to Madrid. And so in 2020, we had talks actually postponed. So Glasgow was supposed to happen earlier in 2020, but again, because of the pandemic, that was delayed. And so when COP26 actually really happened, there was a lot of excitement to it because there had been a long gap between the last COP and now this COP. And so the issues at hand were basically carbon market rules. How is the market going to happen? Then there was supposed to be discussion on the timeline for updating emissions and cutting pledges, and then giving payments to climate vulnerable nations, that whoever is going to be the most affected by climate change, the global community had to take responsibility. For example, when it comes to small island states who are going to even get submerged as a result of climate change, how do you essentially make sure that they're adapting to climate change, but also that they receive payments and funding in order to combat climate change? So there's some ideas about climate policy. I've given you a sense of the history of it all. You have a sense of the infrastructure and the framework regarding climate change. But trying to tie it back into public policy, that's actually very interesting. And these are 5 different ideas about climate policy that are going to make it something that you can actually think about as well. The idea is that these are constantly changing. The fact is that as public policy, climate policy is reshaped, it's modified, it's changed, and it's rejected for new policies. For example, we've seen that transition from Kyoto in 97 to the Paris Agreement more recently in 2015. And in this environment, in this policy atmosphere that's constantly changing and adapting, how do we make policy action happen that is well suited to climate action, right? And so that's our number one challenge. Number two is that it must be inferred, or you can say it has to be guessed that from the actions and behavior of many government agencies and officials involved over time. For example, if you look at Pakistan's climate policy over time, you would note that in our recent government, there's been more action regarding climate. It's more of a political priority as well, right? Why that is something for us to unpack and try to understand as well. That well, is that more of the timings right in terms of the global efforts, or is that something when you can think about in terms of the advocacy coalition framework when it comes to Pakistan as well? Has that impacted the fact that climate is a political priority as well? Number three, it's a process and not something that can be actually determined by a single event or decision, right? And that's something for us to remember about public policy as well, right? A single event or a single decision, for example, even the Paris Agreement, doesn't impact climate policy at large, but little policies, different events as a collective whole becomes a policy process. That's something that influences international climate policy as a whole. Number four is that climate policy itself, it's complex and it's taking place on multiple levels. In this case, we have it's happening at the international level, at the national level, then it's happening at the provincial level for Pakistan and at the local level as well, right? So it's happening on multiple different levels, and that really makes it more complex to understand as well. And then it makes the action more difficult as well. And so we need to try to understand that as well. And lastly, there will be winners and losers in the international climate policy making process. What we mean by that is, for example, if as a bloc, you are negotiating for something, for example, as a small island state, you are arguing that you have to receive that $100 billion per year commitment from Copenhagen that is going to be for the global community as a whole, and you're really vying for it. But at the same time, the fact that only $80 billion was achieved, that means that that goal wasn't really realized, right? And so that's a constant process. Part of the negotiating process, and how all of that really changes really affects how you're going to be able to unpack and try to understand international climate policy. So this is just a sense of the overview and the international stage on climate policy. I want to take a step back and open the floor for questions first, and then we're going to try to discuss Pakistan's scenario as well within the Q&A. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Maha. It was such an informative session. We got to know a lot about the climate structure and the policies, and the floor is open. Anyone can ask the question. Yeah, I also love the presentation. It was very well presentable, remarkable presentation.
All right, so Hira, if you can perhaps take questions and then I can answer them as well.
Yes,
I think there are a lot of things in the chat box as well.
I'm just waiting. If anyone wants to ask the question, they can just raise their hand or like just ask. That's fine. Yes, please, Mashal, go ahead. Thank you.
Firstly, thank you so much for this presentation. I love the presentation itself, but it's also super informative. And I wanted to kind of ask your opinion in this sense of what do you think in Pakistan are the most pressing climate issues? It's very general, but what are the most pressing climate issues in Pakistan that aren't being tackled? And if you know, then which places in Pakistan, if there's any organizations which actually work on these kinds of issues?
Excellent issue, Mashal. And of course, for Pakistan, there are a number of different issues that come to hand. First of all, I'm going to try to give you the major sense of it all. So when it comes to our energy mix, how we actually have been generating electricity or producing our own primary energy, that has been heavily dependent on what we call dirty energy. And particularly in Pakistan's case, it has been heavily dependent on oil and gas. And so that is changing because we have these commitments when it comes to renewable energy. We want to ensure, for example, in our nationally determined contribution document for Pakistan, Pakistan committed to the fact that it's going to try to make sure that 60% of its energy was actually met through renewables, right? Whether or not we're actually going to be able to achieve this requires a lot of not just political will, but also action on the ground to ensure that we're actually going to make this happen, right? So in terms of just changing our entire the way we are consuming energy, but also our overall practices when it comes to climate. So that would be one of our crucial issues and one that's actually highlighted in our nationally determined contribution. Another sector that has been heavily affecting our own carbon emissions is our transport sector. Again, our NDC claims that we're going to try to make the transition with 30% of our transport switching to electric vehicles. Now, whether or not that's actually going to be happening or not is again contentious and really depends on a number of different factors, right? And so that's something that also has to keep in mind as well. Maham, just to recap, Mashal asked what are the main issues for Pakistan when it comes to climate change, but also which are some of the organizations who are working towards climate change. And so I'm first answering the first part of the question, that what are the main issues, and then we're going to try to unpack some of the organizations who are working on climate change. All right, and so what Pakistan really wants to be able to do is change its development framework, right? The way we develop as a country needs to be aligned with what our climate priorities are. And if we're able to do that, that would mean huge changes in not just the way we consume energy, but also the way we have sustainable agriculture practices, sustainable transport, all of that, right? So all of that is interlinked and part of our development agenda. So that's just to give you a holistic picture of Pakistan and its climate change issues, because of the fact that when it comes to the effects of climate change, we are some of the most vulnerable, right? You've seen the rise in droughts, you've seen the rise in extreme weather events like heat waves and floods. And so that's just a really tangible impact that we're experiencing as a country, right? And that has an economic cost attached to it as well. And so that's just going to keep worsening. In fact, some projections say that unfortunately, by 2050, if we don't dramatically change the way we're developing, and if we don't make those transboundary commitments as well, we may even run out of water by 2050, right? That's a grave concept to grapple with. But again, something to keep in mind how urgent this issue is and why we need to work towards it. A number of different organizations, Marshall, who are working on climate change. Of course, we even have a ministry on climate change, which is a huge step in the right direction as well. Number of different NGOs such as Sustainable Development Policy Institute, for example, produces great work related to climate as well. And now a lot of organizations have started working more towards climate change. So that's encouraging as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Umar, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for this wonderful session, ma'am. My question is very simple. That you have said that we are addressing climate change at global level, national level, and then up to local levels. So what do you think will be the implications if the global leaders, for example, it is expected that China will be the global leader by 2030. And we all know what is the point of view of China with reference to addressing climate change. So what will be the implications for the world community and specifically for Pakistan, because Pakistan is vulnerable to climate change. So can you please comment on that if the leaders are like, they are not thinking in the right direction?
Yeah, so excellent question, Omar. So previously what was happening was that China was taking a bit of a back seat when it came to climate change, right? But increasingly, specifically with President Xi Jinping, what we've seen is that China has developed this greater understanding of climate change. They've agreed to phase out coal, for example. what that means for the global communities, of course, steps in the right direction. But what is happening on the ground is sometimes that during this phasing out process, the way in which China, for example, when it comes to the Belt and Road project, for example, when it comes to CPEC within that project, whether or not that's going to be necessarily aligned with climate is something to keep in mind as well, right? For example, in the beginning, even when it comes to CPEC, some coal projects were a part of CPEC, right? That has changed over time with greater awareness on climate change. So you're right, when it comes to China as a global leader, the way in which China is developing itself, but also the fact that China has increasingly been able to indigenize a lot of renewable energy for itself, right? It's been able to have those technological advancements made towards climate change. So that's a step in the right direction. Whether or not that's going to be aligned with what China is doing itself, to whether or not it's doing that with its development partners, that's something that, for example, Pakistan as a country will need to stress on its own, right? To keep its commitment, to make sure that how China is progressing towards its climate change goals, Pakistan is also going in that direction, instead of there being that misalignment. I hope that answers your question, Omar.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Mema, please ask your question.
Yeah. So I have two questions. First one is, what are some of the most effective climate action strategies that are being implemented in the Western nations? Matlab, like, I want to know from, because you do understand the entire arena, you understand the global perspective. So would you matlab, comment on that? What are the most effective strategies or actions you've seen in the Western nations, which can also be translated to countries like Pakistan or India or etc. The second question is that about climate change, there's still a lot of people that I have come across in my even exchange program to US and in general about in Pakistan. People don't really understand the urgency about climate change, and some people even do not believe that climate change is real. For example, a small example can be Greta Thunberg. When she was doing all her activism, a lot of people, and I used to see so many posts, people were saying it's nothing and she's just doing it all for the attention, despite the fact it's scientifically proven. So what are the climate agencies, like the world climate agencies, doing towards increasing awareness in terms of this, in terms of just telling people that it's real and it's happening? What are some of the efforts being done to aware people about this?
So excellent question, Mama. So first, I'm going to try to talk about climate change denial, and of course, that's a huge problem as well, right? I think somebody commented in the chat box as well that Donald Trump was a climate change denier. I think it's Mohammed Bisanjo, and that's absolutely correct. In fact, that was a huge setback during the post-Paris process, right? So Obama and President Xi Jinping at the time had agreed to a lot, that the US and China were going to work together to combat climate change. Then Trump government and the Trump administration comes into power, and all of that is undone. In fact, the US actually backed out of the Paris Agreement during the Trump era, right? And then with President Biden, now they're going back to the process, trying to undo a lot of the damage that was already done. And so, yeah, climate change denial is real. Unfortunately, that has huge implications for the way in which countries are going to tackle climate change as well, right? So your question is, how do we create awareness surrounding it? So the positive thing is that through these, in the last 10 years specifically, unfortunately, because of the rise in extreme weather events, climate change itself has become more tangible for a lot of people, right? The fact that lives are affected, and the fact that the IPCC has given solid evidence that climate change is a man-made process, right? So pehle there was like this disagreement or contention that, oh, is it man-made or is it not? But now there is actual concrete evidence that there are man-made links to climate change. So that has really eased the way in which, when you try to create awareness surrounding it. Organizations like the Climate Reality Project, for example, are working really on the ground to ensure that there's an increase in awareness as well. Now, the problem is whether or not there is awareness doesn't necessarily translate into political commitments at different country levels as well, right? Or at the global level. So while there's increased awareness on the ground with a lot of people, it's not necessarily enough to ensure that there's going to be those political commitments. And so I would encourage civil society to be more active. There are a lot of NGOs who are more active, who are working on the ground. So all the stakeholders as a whole really need to come together to solve this problem, right? And we see a lot of youth activism as well when it comes to climate action, right? In Pakistan, we have a lot of youth leaders emerge who are trying to create awareness on climate change. We know that there's greater sensitivity towards the impact of climate change as well. It's a slow process, but it's happening, right? So that's the positive thing. Now coming to the first half of your question, which was examples from developed countries. Um, I think the low-hanging fruit in general is the fact that there's a lot of commitments and strides and advancement made when it comes to renewable energy, right? So we see a lot of countries, for example, Germany is a huge pioneer when it comes to solar energy and as well. And so we're seeing that those technological advancements, and whether or not that is actually the challenge for developing countries would be to make sure that those commitments are actually a technology transfer as well, right? Like when it comes to renewable energy, there is that. When it comes to climate funding, there's that technology transfer element to it. And so that's something to keep in mind as well, to try to indigenize the renewable energy process to ensure that cost comes down. Because at the end of the day, the capital cost of renewable energy has been a huge challenge. And while that has come down over time, for example, India may it reached parity in 2013, for example, right? Coal or solar. Then it became economically viable to actually switch to solar rather than coal. So if things like that happen, that's a step in the right direction.
I hope that answers Umema's question. Let's move to Sufyan. Ji Sufyan. You're mute. Sufyan, you're mute.
Hello, can you? Okay, my question is regarding Pakistan's effort. We talk about we often see we often heard everyone is talking about we are the most vulnerable nation on this and the side. But what are the causes? Like we are vulnerable because of our own problems, or we are vulnerable because of the other one's problems? And my second, just to, can you unpack this vulnerability kind of phenomena? And second question is regarding deforestation or tree is one side of the dimension of the problem, and we are going full board on the billion tree tsunami and other kind of stuff, but but we hardly talk about the water pollution, we hardly talk about the air pollution, and then there are other things. So how do you see, is it a just kind of one kind of commitment on the advocacy side, or we are taking the problem rather comprehensively? Thank you.
Yeah, so if I understand, there are two parts to your question. First of all, is Pakistan responsible for climate change as well, and because it's greatly impacted by it as well? And I believe your second question is whether or not we are going the right direction. For example, deforestation, we have a focus, but are we focusing on these other parts, like for example, pollution? Is that a good summary of your question, Safian?
Yes. Your take on our effort regarding water pollution, air pollution, and other kind of pollution activities that we are doing. Like industrial pollution is one thing, and wastewater treatment, other kind of stuff. Thank you.
Okay. ठीक है. So first of all, as I told you in the presentation as well, that Pakistan is responsible for less than 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions, right? So in terms of the global volume, we are very part of the small fraction when it comes to global greenhouse gas emissions, right? But when it comes to the impact, we are unfortunately in the top 10 countries that are part of the climate risk index as well, right? Our number keeps switching. For example, this year we're number 8, but we have consistently been part of the climate risk index, and what that means is we are going to be greatly impacted by the effects of climate change. Now, that is very, very unfair, you would say, but that is unfortunately a problem of geography as well, right? The way that we're situated, the fact that we are near the equator, we are near the Indian Ocean, and the fact that we have in terms of geography, we are very vulnerable to climate change. So that's unfortunate. What is really unfortunate is the small island state countries, right? Like, for example, countries like Maldives, for example, are not even responsible for, we're still part of a significant amount in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but countries like Maldives have even a very tiny fraction in terms of their contribution, but they're actually going to sink below global sea level, right? Because of the fact that they are a small island state. And so वो countries जो हैं वो तो extremely vulnerable हैं, and they're not even part of the problem, right? And this is why countries are operating in blocks and actually negotiating as well, because it's unjust, the fact that developed countries have unfortunately contributed more to the problem, but in terms of the impact, the more vulnerable you are geographically, but even financially, if you're not going to be able to fund the kind of adaptation that is needed, makes you more vulnerable to climate, right? Even within Pakistan, if you are unfortunately closer to the poverty line, you are more likely to be affected by climate change, right? So all of these are really, really unfair, which is why climate is not just political issue. It's also, well, it is a political issue, but it's also linked to climate justice, right? Because it's really, really unfair the way, the fact that if you're not responsible for the problem, you're still going to be impacted by it. So that's the first half of your question. Second is the fact that we really need to distinguish between climate and the environment, right? Climate change, when we talk about it as a problem, we link it to greenhouse gas emissions. Uske andar deforestation plays a huge role because we consider that to be a carbon sink in terms of net zero की हम बात करते हैं, carbon removal में trees का बहुत historic role रहा है, right? So उस point of view से तो it makes sense in trying to combat climate change. Environment के part में, when it comes to things like, for example, you were saying pollution, water pollution हो गई, air pollution हो गई, all of that, that's a huge problem that Pakistan is not even tackling properly at the moment. And I think we probably need to have another talk dedicated entirely to pollution. So I think I'll stop there so that we don't run out of time, but lots to unpack there in terms of pollution.
Thank you. I think Mosna raised her hand, and if you want to ask.
Yeah. Assalamualaikum. So my question might be very basic, or I don't know, but for example, जिस तरह की agreements होती हैं, we talk about the Paris Agreement, या इस तरह मतलब वो ये अब scenario is very unfair कि जो superpowers हैं या जो elite countries हैं, like they are contributing a lot to it, but they're not showing that much responsibility. So what are the repercussions? कि मतलब अगर कोई country does not oblige with whatever they said कि they're going to do, मतलब accountability वगैरह का क्या होता है इस तरह की जो भी resolutions वगैरह जब pass होते हैं? So if a country does not oblige by, then what is the worst that can happen?
Yeah, excellent question. So in international relations, the phrase that is often used is that the international climate politics is in a state of anarchy, right? What that means is that there is no global government responsible for making sure that every country is abiding by the rules, right? Rules themselves are actually part of this very fluid process. Like, for example, the Paris Agreement, all countries had to agree to it. They made sure that they ratified it within their parliaments, agreed to the set of rules, and then it was because everyone knows that top-down चीजें सही तरह implement नहीं होती. They decided that this was going to be a bottom-up process. Every country was going to come up with their own nationally determined contributions, come up with their own set of rules, because that can become more legally binding, right? A national document within a country's sovereign borders, that can be implemented. Whereas जो global goals हैं, global rules हैं, वो आप agree कर सकते हो in theory, but it requires, it's more आप international norms create कर देते हो, because this is what we agree on. But whether or not you can actually enforce them is problematic. Even things that can go to the International Court of Justice, for example, बहुत कम चीजें होती हैं that actually can actually be enforced, right? In international, within countries, right? What actually ends up happening is that it really depends on the international climate politics, which countries are more powerful, which are not, what gets enforced, what doesn't get enforced. But again, that's what makes it tricky, right? Because up to NDCs themselves, then individually agree karke, then they don't lead up to that global goal that you've agreed on, right? And you've technically agreed on it, but how legally binding is it? Technically, it's legally binding, but it again is part of the whole idea that countries, global government nahi hai. So we're again part of that same problem. So good question, Mosina. It's actually deeply frustrating because we have this international political setup in which things are sometimes really unfair then as well, right? For example, even UN Security Council की जब हम बात करते हैं उसमें फिर वो अपनी problematic चीजें आ जाती हैं, right? Like, it becomes hard to enforce. So that's in a nutshell. But good question.
Yeah, I also like Musna's question, and thank you for a wonderful answer. There's one question from the fellow. He's in the library, so he cannot talk. So I'm asking on his behalf. Muhammad is from Balochistan, one of our fellows. So he asked that lower income countries tend to have economics built around climate sensitive goods like agriculture and other natural resources, and are often hit worse by climate disasters. What ways can be adopted to such countries, mainly those who rely on agriculture, as an example of Pakistan?
Hira, if you can summarize what he's asking again, like in terms of agriculture?
Yeah, he just wanted to ask about the climate disasters that happen, and how can we rely on the agriculture sector when it comes to like the lower income countries such as Pakistan?
Yeah. All right. Absolutely good question. And as I said in terms of the presentation as well, agriculture and agriculture practices are one of the sectors that are hugely responsible towards greenhouse gas emissions as well, right? For example, the dairy sector, the fact that methane as a gas, CH4, is hugely responsible for, is one of the greenhouse gases that we consider when it comes to the overall carbon footprint, right? And so the way in which, if we make our agriculture more sustainable, if we go towards those practices, that has a huge impact on whether or not we're going to be able to realize our climate change goals. These practices can include, for example, more sustainable ways of, for example, dairy farming, and then traditional agriculture as we know it, for example, the way we grow crops. For example, what kind of crops are you growing? Are they more water intensive or are they not water intensive if you are a country that's going to be impacted hugely by climate change, right? So taking those considerations into mind, the kind of crops that we're growing, the way in which we are, the way in which we are conducting our agriculture practices, all of that is going to have an impact on how we actually combat climate change.
I hope that answers Mohammed's question. Thank you. Can we take one last question if we're not running out of time? Till then the other speaker joined, right? Thank you. Daniel, please go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. I wanted to ask a question. Basically, जितनी भी हम बातें करते हैं तो वो mostly advocacy की मतलब on those lines होती है, या बातें हम मतलब मेरा ये क्वेश्चन था कि on an individual level basically हर individual क्या कर सकता है in order to like play his part in this whole climate debate. Advocacy अपनी जगह ठीक है, pressure group, लेकिन मैं ये कह रहा हूँ कि पॉलिसी मेकर्स के अलावा, फॉर एग्जांपल अ स्टूडेंट, मुझे कुछ भी नहीं पता, या इसी तरह बहुत सारे लोग हैं जो हमारे मुल्क में, तो बेसिकली आई थिंक इंडिविजुअल लेवल पे भी कुछ ना कुछ इस तरह की बातें होनी चाहिए कि यार अच्छा फॉर एग्जांपल सोलर पे कन्वर्ट कर लो घर, ठीक है, और इसके अलावा तो आई जस्ट वांटेड टू नो कि क्या वो चीजें हो सकती हैं व्हिच वी कैन डू ऑन एन इंडिविजुअल लेवल. थैंक यू.
Yeah, excellent question, Daniel. And in fact, जब भी हम बात करते हैं, because it's a multi-level problem, individual action की भी definitely बात आती है कि how are we supposed to play our own role in terms of climate change, right? What are the kind of practices that we need to change in our own lives, right? One of the huge sectors that are responsible towards climate change, especially when it comes to cities, is the transport sector, right? So I would encourage and anyone who is sensitized about climate change to ensure that they monitor their own carbon footprint as well, right? For example, in terms of transport, if there are public transport options available, try to use those, right? If public transport is not available, try to carpool. Like, for example, it's really unsustainable if only one person is traveling in a car, right? Like things like that, small steps that are responsible in terms of the overall picture. If you can change those practices within your own lives, that really, it's what they say. There's a saying that says that the good that you do may be a drop in the ocean, but the ocean is less without that missing drop, right? So just do your own part. Think of ways in which your own carbon footprint can be reduced. But what is really interesting is वही अगर आप scale की जब बात करते हो, हमें critical mass भी achieve करना है, right? So individual action, it has to be in that form of collective action, क्योंकि तभी उसका actual impact होगा in terms of the larger scheme of things. So in fact, कभी कभार criticism भी आता है when it comes to just focusing on individual action, क्योंकि उससे ये होता है, unfortunately, what corporations try to do, especially fossil fuel corporations try to do, is try to shift the blame from that huge corporate practices to just individual action. तो हमें वो भी नहीं करना, हमने अपना individual action monitor करना है, but at the same time keep the pressure alive when it comes to creating that collective action and as a civil society as a whole. But yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much, Ms. Maha. I think it was such a wonderful session. We thoroughly enjoyed learning about the international climate policy, and I hope our fellows going to continue to learn about the climate change and the pitfalls of environmental disaster in Pakistan and across globe. Because this is one of the, after COVID, I feel like this is one of the major problem we face as a global family. So I think we can hopefully address those issues in near future. Thank you for your contributions to Learners Republic. Hope to see you next year also.
Inshallah, thank you. It was lovely meeting all of you. Inshallah, hope to stay connected. I've shared my email in case you do want to, you have follow-up questions or just want to reach out in general. So yeah, all the best with everything. Thank you. Allah Hafiz.
Allah Hafiz.